On January 20th, 2026, the President of the United States declared there is no going back on a territorial ambition that has Europe preparing for economic war. He posted AI generated images of himself holding an American flag on foreign soil. He leaked private text messages with world leaders. And he refused to rule out military force to seize an island 4 times the size of Texas. This isn't historical fiction. This is happening right now. And what started as political theater has become the biggest crisis NATO has faced since its founding in 1949. This is the Greenland standoff, and it's about to reshape the global order. Let's establish the facts. On January 20th, 2026, President Donald Trump made a series of public statements declaring Greenland imperative for national and world security. According to Reuters, Trump posted this message after a phone call with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. There can be no going back. On that, everyone agrees. But here's where it gets unusual. Trump didn't just issue a statement. He posted AI-generated mock-up images showing himself in Greenland, holding the U.S. flag. Another image depicted a map with Canada and Greenland absorbed into American territory. Then came the leaks. According to Politico and Reuters, Trump publicly shared screenshots of private text message exchanges with French President Emmanuel Macron and other world leaders. In these messages, Macron questioned what Trump was doing on Greenland. Trump's response was swift. He threatened a 200% tariff on French wines and champagnes. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, European leaders gathered to respond. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen stated plainly, "I am certainly not going to abandon Greenland." According to Reuters, she added, "The American president has unfortunately not ruled out the use of military force, and therefore the rest of us cannot rule it out either." That's the situation. An American president publicly demanding control of an autonomous Danish territory, with AI images, with leaked texts, and with threats of both military action and economic warfare. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what Greenland actually is. Greenland is the world's largest island, roughly 836,000 square miles. That's about 4 times the size of Texas. It has a population of just 57,000 people. It's a semi-autonomous territory of Denmark. That means Greenland governs itself in most domestic matters, but Denmark handles foreign affairs and defense. The relationship dates back over 300 years when Denmark colonized the island. In 1953, Greenland's status changed from colony to an integral part of the Kingdom of Denmark. Then, in 1979, Greenland gained home rule, and in 2009, it achieved self-government. But here's the key fact. Greenland is not independent. It remains under Danish sovereignty. Now, the United States has had a presence in Greenland since World War II. According to the 1951 Defense of Greenland Agreement, documented by Yale Law School's Avalon Project, the U.S. and Denmark agreed to cooperate on the defense of Greenland. This agreement explicitly recognizes the sovereignty of the Kingdom of Denmark over the island. Under this agreement, the U.S. operates Pitufik Space Base, formerly known as Thule Air Base, in northern Greenland. It's home to early warning radar systems that detect ballistic missile launches. It's a critical part of North American defense infrastructure. So the United States already has a military foothold in Greenland. It's been there for over 70 years, with Denmark's consent. Trump's position appears to be this: that arrangement isn't enough. He wants ownership. And he's framing it as a matter of national and world security. But what does that actually mean? According to analysis from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Greenland sits at a strategic crossroads. It's positioned between North America and Europe. It overlooks key Arctic shipping routes that are opening as ice melts due to climate change. It also contains significant mineral deposits, rare earth elements, like neodymium, praseodymium, and dysprosium, materials essential for batteries, wind turbines, and military technologies. China currently dominates the global rare earth supply chain. Greenland represents a potential alternative source. Then there's the geopolitical angle. Russia has been expanding its Arctic presence. China has declared itself a near Arctic state, despite being thousands of miles away. Both nations have expressed interest in Arctic shipping routes and resource extraction. Trump and his supporters argue that if the U.S. doesn't secure Greenland, someone else will. But here's the problem: Greenland isn't for sale, and Denmark is a NATO ally. Let's walk through what actually happened, step by step, based on confirmed reporting. The AI images. On January 20th, Trump posted AI-generated images to social media. One showed him standing in Greenland holding a U.S. flag. Another depicted a map where both Greenland and Canada appeared as U.S. territories. According to TBS News and Politico, these images were widely circulated and prompted immediate backlash in Denmark and Greenland. Now, to be clear, these are digital mock-ups. They're not real photographs, but they represent something significant: a visual claim of territorial control being broadcast to millions of people worldwide. The leaked text messages. Then came the text leaks. According to Reuters and Politico, Trump shared screenshots of private diplomatic exchanges with world leaders, including Emmanuel Macron and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. In the exchange with Macron, the French president reportedly asked what Trump was doing on Greenland. Trump responded by threatening a 200% tariff on French wines and champagnes. Diplomatic communications between heads of state are typically confidential. Leaking them publicly is a breach of diplomatic norms. It signals either transparency to supporters or a disregard for traditional statecraft, depending on your perspective. Former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who also served as Denmark's prime minister from 2001 to 2009, told Reuters, "The time for flattering is over. It doesn't work." The fact is, Trump only respects force and strength and unity. Rasmussen called the Greenland crisis the biggest challenge to NATO since its establishment in 1949. Denmark's response: Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen held a press conference in Copenhagen on January 20th. According to Reuters, she stated, "I am certainly not going to abandon Greenland. I made that decision a long time ago as Danish Prime Minister." She continued, "The American president has unfortunately not ruled out the use of military force, and therefore the rest of us cannot rule it out either. So it is a natural consequence of what the American president has said and has not said." That's a remarkable statement. A NATO ally saying they cannot rule out the possibility of American military aggression. Greenland's reaction. Greenland's leadership has been equally defiant. According to Reuters, tens of thousands of people rallied in Copenhagen and Nuuk, Greenland's capital, on the weekend of January 17th and 18th. They chanted, "Greenland is not for sale," and marched to U.S. diplomatic posts. And then there's the red baseball caps. According to Arctic Today and Reuters, a Copenhagen vintage shop owner named Jesper Rabe Tonnessen designed red caps that mock Trump's Make America Great Again hats. They feature slogans like "Make America Go Away" and "Already Great." One slogan reads, "Nu det nok," a Danish pun that sounds like "Nu det nok," meaning "now is enough," but substitutes nuke for knock. Tonnessen told Reuters, "People have an urge to get out there with a message. We've just had enough, and we're fed up, sad and tired." The caps went viral. Initially, only 100 were made. Within days, demand skyrocketed. Protesters wore them at demonstrations. The caps became a symbol of resistance. The tariff threats. On Saturday, January 17th, Trump announced he would impose new tariffs on 8 European nations until the U.S. is allowed to buy Greenland. According to CNN and NPR, the targeted nations include Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. Trump told Norway's prime minister in a leaked text exchange, I have done more for NATO than any other person since its founding, and now NATO should do something for the United States. That message, reported by Reuters, frames Greenland as compensation for American defense spending. The market reaction. Financial markets reacted immediately. According to Reuters, Wall Street's main indexes opened sharply lower on January 20th. Gold prices touched record highs, a classic sign of risk aversion. U.S. Treasuries were sold off. Investors are now pricing in the risk of a transatlantic trade war. The European Union's position at the World Economic Forum in Davos, European leaders attempted to project unity. French President Macron stated, according to Reuters, we do believe that we need more growth, we need more stability in this world, but we do prefer respect to bullies. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen described a seismic change that made it necessary to build, in her words, a new form of European independence. One is a package of tariffs on 93 billion euros. That's $109 billion of U.S. imports. According to Reuters and Politico, this package could automatically activate on February 6th after a 6-month suspension. Another option is the so-called Anti-Coercion Instrument, or ACI. This is the EU's trade bazooka. According to CNBC and Euronews, the ACI allows the EU to impose tough measures against countries that use trade to influence European policy. It's never been used before, but Macron and other leaders have said it's now on the table. The ACI could restrict U.S. access to public tenders, investments, banking activity, or trade in services, the sector where the U.S. has a trade surplus with Europe. That includes digital services from U.S. tech giants like Google, Amazon, Meta, and Apple. In other words, Europe could hit American companies where it really hurts. Treasury Secretary Bessent's pushback. At Davos, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent attempted to downplay the crisis. According to Reuters, he said, it's been 48 hours. As I said, sit back, relax. I am confident that the leaders will not escalate and that this will work out in a manner that ends up in a very good place for all. He called the reaction hysteria. But the rhetoric from European capitals suggests otherwise. Russia's opportunistic response. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov weighed in on January 20th. According to Reuters, Lavrov stated, Greenland is not a natural part of Denmark. It was neither a natural part of Norway nor a natural part of Denmark. It is a colonial conquest. This is significant. Russia has been watching the Greenland standoff with what Reuters described as glee. Any fracture in NATO benefits Moscow. By questioning Danish sovereignty over Greenland, Russia is subtly legitimizing territorial revisionism. If the U.S. can challenge established borders, why can't Russia? That's the evidence. AI images, leaked texts, threats of military force and economic coercion, mass protests, market turmoil, and geopolitical rivals exploiting the chaos. So what does this actually mean beneath the headlines? Let's start with the most obvious question. Why now? Trump first floated the idea of buying Greenland during his first term in 2019. It was widely dismissed as a distraction, but in January 2026, he's returned to it with unprecedented intensity. There are a few possible explanations. First, strategic realism. From a national security perspective, Greenland matters. According to analysis from War on the Rocks and the Center for Strategic and International Studies, control of Greenland would give the U.S. dominance over Arctic shipping routes, early warning systems, and rare earth mineral deposits. Climate change is opening the Arctic. New shipping lanes could cut transit times between Europe and Asia by thousands of miles. Russia and China are positioning themselves to exploit this. The U.S. wants to be there first. Greenland also sits atop the GI-UK gap, the Greenland-Iceland-UK maritime choke point. During the Cold War, NATO used this corridor to monitor Soviet submarines. Today, It's relevant again as Russian naval activity increases. So the strategic argument is real. But here's the problem. The US already has access to Greenland through the 1951 agreement. It already operates military bases there. Denmark is a cooperative ally. So why the aggressive posture? Second, transactional diplomacy. Trump's approach to foreign policy has always been transactional. He views alliances as contracts. He believes the US is being taken advantage of, and he uses threats, economic or otherwise, as negotiating tools. In the leaked text to Norway's prime minister, Trump said, "I have done more for NATO than any other person since its founding. And now, NATO should do something for the United States." That's the transactional framing. The US spends billions defending Europe. Europe should pay, either in cash or in territory. But NATO doesn't work that way. It's a collective defense alliance. Article 5 of the NATO Treaty states that an attack on one member is an attack on all. It's not a protection racket. By framing NATO as a business deal, Trump is challenging the foundational premise of the alliance. Third, domestic political theater. There's also a domestic angle. Trump's base responds to bold nationalist rhetoric. The image of planting an American flag on Greenland plays well with supporters who view him as a strong leader expanding American power. The AI mock-ups, the leaked texts, the defiant tone, all of it generates media coverage. It dominates the news cycle. It energizes his political movement. But the costs are real. Markets are reacting. Allies are pulling away. Trust is eroding. Fourth, the breakdown of diplomatic norms. The leaking of private diplomatic texts is extraordinary. Former NATO boss Rasmussen told Reuters that the time for flattering is over. But what he's really acknowledging is that traditional diplomatic engagement, private conversations, back channels, face-saving compromises, no longer works with Trump. Trump prefers public confrontation. He uses social media as a weapon. He bypasses traditional diplomacy in favor of spectacle. This creates a problem. If world leaders can't trust that their private communications will remain private, they'll stop communicating candidly. Diplomacy becomes theater, and theater doesn't solve problems. Fifth, Europe's strategic awakening. Ironically, Trump's Greenland push may be accelerating the very thing he claims to oppose: European independence. For decades, Europe has relied on the United States for defense. Trump has repeatedly criticized this. He's demanded that Europe spend more on its own military. Now, Europe is listening. Ursula von der Leyen's speech in Davos called for a new form of European independence. Macron invoked the anti-coercion instrument. Former NATO chief Rasmussen proposed a three-point plan that includes European firms partnering with the US to extract Greenland's minerals and a stronger NATO presence on the island. But all of this assumes cooperation. If Trump is willing to threaten military force against a NATO ally, why would Europe trust the US to be a reliable partner? The more Trump pushes, the more Europe will pursue strategic autonomy. And a Europe that doesn't depend on the United States is a fundamentally different global order. Sixth, the precedent problem. Here's the most dangerous aspect. If the United States, a champion of international law and territorial integrity, openly pursues the territorial acquisition of a NATO ally's land, what message does that send? Russia has already seized Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine. China claims vast swaths of the South China Sea. If borders can be redrawn through coercion, the entire post-World War II international order collapses. This is why Denmark's Mette Frederiksen said that if the US takes Greenland by force, it would mark the end of NATO, because NATO exists to prevent exactly this kind of territorial aggression. If NATO members start threatening each other, the alliance has no purpose. So why should you care about an island most people have never thought about? Because this isn't really about Greenland. It's about whether the rules-based international order still exists. It's about whether alliances mean anything. It's about whether economic coercion and military threats are acceptable tools of diplomacy among democratic allies. Let's break down the real world consequences. For NATO, if this crisis isn't resolved, NATO faces an existential threat. Rasmussen called it the biggest challenge since 1949. That's not hyperbole. NATO's credibility rests on collective defense. If one member threatens another, the whole system breaks. Europe is preparing to hit back economically. 93 billion in tariffs. The anti-coercion instrument targeting US tech companies. If this escalates into a full-scale trade war, global growth slows. Supply chains fracture. Inflation rises. You'll feel it in prices at the grocery store, at the gas pump, in the cost of electronics. For geopolitics, Russia and China are watching. If the US and Europe are divided, Moscow and Beijing have more room to maneuver. Russia could escalate in Ukraine. China could move on Taiwan, because they'll calculate that the West is too divided to respond effectively. For democracy, there's also a governance question. If leaders can leak private communications, bypass diplomatic norms, and use AI-generated images to claim territory, what does that mean for how international relations function? It means spectacle replaces substance. It means trust erodes. And it means the world becomes more unpredictable, more volatile, and more dangerous. This matters, not just for Denmark or Greenland, but for everyone. So where does this go from here? Let's look at the most likely scenarios. Scenario 1. De-escalation through negotiation. Treasury Secretary Bessent is banking on this. In this scenario, the rhetoric cools. Back-channel diplomacy intensifies. The US and Denmark reach a new agreement that strengthens American military presence in Greenland without changing sovereignty. Rasmussen's three-point plan offers a roadmap. Update the 1951 Defense Agreement, create an investment pact for mineral extraction, and establish a joint US-European resilience compact to counter Chinese and Russian influence. This is the rational outcome, but it requires both sides to compromise. And it requires Trump to walk back his no-going-back rhetoric. Scenario 2. Economic warfare. If diplomacy fails, Europe could pull the trigger on the anti-coercion instrument. According to Politico and CNBC, this could restrict U.S. tech companies' access to the European market. It could impose tariffs on American services. It could freeze investments. The U.S. would retaliate. Tariffs on European goods. Restrictions on financial transactions. This scenario means a prolonged trade war. Markets would react negatively. Global economic growth would slow. And critically, it would widen the rift between the U.S. and Europe. Scenario 3. Military posturing. Denmark has already begun moving more troops into Greenland. According to the war zone, Danish forces are increasing their presence as a signal of resolve. If Trump continues to refuse to rule out military force, NATO could conduct exercises in the Arctic to demonstrate collective defense. This scenario doesn't mean war, but it means militarization, and it means the Arctic becomes a flashpoint. Scenario 4, Greenlandic independence. There's also a wild card. If Greenland feels caught between the US and Denmark, it could pursue full independence. According to analysis from the Arctic Institute, Greenland has long debated independence, but it lacks the economic capacity to sustain itself without subsidies from Denmark. However, if the US offered financial support in exchange for strategic access, Greenland could declare independence and negotiate directly with Washington. This would be a humiliation for Denmark, but it could offer a face-saving exit for all parties. Here's what we don't know: how serious Trump is. Is this a negotiating tactic, a distraction from domestic issues, or a genuine strategic shift? Treasury Secretary Bessent says to sit back, relax. But European leaders aren't relaxed. And until Trump clarifies his intentions and demonstrates a willingness to compromise, This crisis will continue to escalate. What we do know is this: the next few weeks are critical. Trump is scheduled to attend the World Economic Forum in Davos this week. He'll meet with European leaders face to face. What happens in those meetings will determine whether this is resolved diplomatically or whether the transatlantic alliance fractures. Let's bring this back to where we started. On January 20th, 2026, the President of the United States declared no going back on acquiring Greenland. He posted AI images claiming the territory. He leaked private diplomatic texts. He threatened military force and economic coercion. This isn't normal, and the consequences are real. NATO is facing its biggest crisis in 75 years. Europe is preparing for economic war. Markets are reacting. Trust is eroding. But beneath the spectacle, there are legitimate strategic questions. Greenland does matter. The Arctic is opening. Rare earth minerals are critical. China and Russia are positioning themselves. The question isn't whether Greenland is strategically important. The question is, how do democratic allies resolve competing interests without threats, coercion, and the breakdown of international norms? Because if the answer is that they can't, then the rules-based order is over, and what replaces it is a world where power is the only currency, where alliances are transactional, where borders are negotiable, where might makes right. Trump's supporters will say this is strength, that the U.S. is finally asserting its interests, that Europe has taken advantage for too long. Critics will say this is recklessness, that it alienates allies, that it undermines the very alliances that have kept the peace for decades. Both perspectives have elements of truth. But here's what's not debatable. The world is watching. Denmark is watching. Greenland is watching. Russia and China are watching. And what they're learning is that in 2026, nothing is off the table. Not territorial acquisition, not military threats against allies, not the public humiliation of democratic partners. The Greenland crisis is a test of whether alliances can survive nationalist populism, a test of whether democratic norms matter, a test of whether the international system built after World War II can adapt or whether it collapses. And the outcome of this test will shape the next decade of global politics. So pay attention, because this story isn't over. It's just beginning. If you want to stay ahead of stories like this, hit subscribe. Share this video with someone who needs to understand what's really happening. And let me know in the comments, do you think this is a negotiating tactic, or is Trump serious about taking Greenland? Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.